Rishus Chaver Mididim, both in person. Rishus Mrs. Bellows, Shetichya Liyamim Tov Baruchim. The Gemara tells us in Maseches Bava Kama that there was a great Jewish leader who passed away. His name was Chizkiyahu. And when the sages of that period sought to memorialize Chizkiyahu, the pasuk describes, as the Gemara explains, v'kavod asulo v'moso. They did something that gave him honor. What would honor this great sage? Malamed shehoshivo yeshiva al kivro. It teaches us that they had a beis medrash. They had people come to learn Torah in his memory. That was the kavod that they accorded to Chizkiyahu. It was an aliyah for his neshama. And so tonight, our limud is le'iloi nishmas R Shael ben Reb Shmuel Zichrono Livracha. You could say that this topic is abstract. It is not a halachic topic. It is not a parsha topic. But it is a topic that, when we think about it, really reflects and expresses a part of our identity, a part of our spiritual DNA that's worth thinking about, exploring, and developing for ourselves. We have a tradition, a spiritual tradition, that the world is built in patterns. And this idea of patterns is found all across Judaism, particularly, you could say, in the world of Kabbalah, in the secrets of Torah. And so one pattern that you'll find, of course, is the pattern of 7. We just spoke about that in last week's parsha with the 7 years, of course, the 7 days of the week, the 7 musical notes. But then, of course, there's a greater pattern than the pattern of 7 days and 7 colors of the rainbow, and the 7 lands that the Jewish people conquered when they entered Eretz Yisrael. That pattern of 7 is really part of a greater pattern. That's how we count. We count on a base 10. 1 through 10, and then you start again at the beginning. When Avram Avinu was promised land, he was promised 10 lands, not 7. And this pattern, which I can only speak to the limited understanding that I have. There are people here who probably know much better. But this pattern reflects the energies that Hashem Yisbarach, that the Rebbe Shalom puts into the world and to each one of us. And this pattern is divided between 3 and 7. It makes 10, but it's divided between 3 and 7. So the pattern of 7 that we live with all the time, those energies, that's the reality of the world that we shape, the natural world. Those are what we call the midos, the spheros, the aspects of the world which are in the olam hamaaseh, the realm of action. And so each day of Sfiras HaOmer, if you look in the Siddur, so in the back of Mariv, when they give you the Sfiras HaOmer, they tell you, oh, we're operating now in a pattern of 7. So last night we counted 36. So last night was the pattern Chesed Shebi Yesod, which we're not going to take the time now, but each one of these is 7, and there's patterns 7 and 7. So this is what we're talking about all the time during Sfiras HaOmer. But there's another pattern. That's the pattern that's higher than the 7s. That's the pattern of 3. 7 is the world in which we live. That's the realm of action. So what are these 3 dimensions that are beyond, that are above that pattern of 7? So this is probably the most well-known acronym in all of Judaism. Chabad. Chabad is an acronym for Chachma, Bina, and Das. These are the 3 aspects, the 3 frames, what we call the kochos haseichel, the aspects of how we think, The other 7 aspects they're how we act. But these 3 are the kochos haseichel. And that's what I'd like to, in just a very brief amount of time, to the extent that maybe any of us can understand what the real depth of these aspects of our own life is about, is to spend a few minutes thinking about what is chachma, what is bina, and what is das. Chachma, bina, and das. That's it. So chachma, you could translate in English as information. You have to know something. You have to know chachma. That is, let's say, a collection of facts, the things that you accumulate. And there is a lot of chachma out there in the world. Chazal tells us in the Gemara Megillah, chachma bagoyim tamin. If you want information, you should ask the experts in cardiology, in mathematics, in all kinds of disciplines. Chachma, there's a lot of information out there that is extremely worthwhile. And we go through our life collecting that chachma, that information. But on a deeper level, there is another type of information that we don't just access when we study or when we listen to a lecture or when we read a book. There's one part of our ability to apprehend things which comes almost instantaneously. It's that assessment. It's not always correct. You have to make sure that your chachma is spot on. But it's the notion that when you see something, you have a sense like, I have this idea, I have this insight, and it came from nowhere. Sometimes it could be, there's someone in our community, he told me that he spends a lot of time in the shower. He takes extraordinarily long showers, and I understand him very well, because he runs a very complicated business, and he told me that's the only safe place where he can think. And sometimes when you have that space, ideas come to you that you didn't have before. That too is an element of chachma. Chachma is not just apprehending the information by studying it. Sometimes it's what the Bnei Yissaschar calls the muskal rishon. You see something, you're like, oh, I got it. I understand that. That resonates with me, or that makes sense to me. The pasuk says in Eov, chachma me'ayin timatzeh. Chachma, sometimes it comes from ayin. Ayin literally means nothing. Sometimes dafka, the chachma, the insight comes when you have ayin. When your mind is so cluttered, it's hard to come up with an idea. But sometimes when you have ayin, when you have nothing, when you're, maybe sitting in the shower for an hour, then all of a sudden, me'ayin timatzeh, you have that muskal rishon. And that's why the pasuk says in Mishlei, b'chachma, the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world with chachma, because it came from nothing. It was like that, I don't know, the Rebbeinu Shalom had this ratzon that there should be a world, and it just came into being. Sometimes it's a chachma, it's a sense that a person has. You have this sense when you meet that person, or you speak to them, there's something that you pick up on right away. Hein yiras Hashem hi chachma. You can detect yiras shamayim because that's part of chachma. So the first thing that we want to focus on when we go through life is cultivating our chachma. Are we learning? Are we growing in chachma, both on the information side, and are we growing in that sense of alertness to what are the messages that are around us? What is that muskal rishon? What is that first thought when we encounter something? That's chachma. That's aleph. But chachma, you could say, it lives in a certain sense on the surface. What is that information? What is that muskal rishon? But then there's something that's deeper. The pasuk says in Mishlei in Perek Gimel, Ashrei Adam Mashta Chachma. It's great if you can find Chachma. Ashrei, that's great. V'Adam Yafik Tevuna. But the question is, lahafik means to bring out. How extraordinary is it if a person can be lahafik, can bring out tuvuna. Tuvuna is milashon bina, insight. So you have information, that's going to be your chachma. But what lives beneath that information? What do you see that's beyond it? The Ribono Shel Olam creates Adam Arishon, and he sees within that first initial creation, he sees the capacity for someone else. He sees the capacity for Chava. So Vayiven, the Ribono Shel Olam uses the word Vayiven, he builds Chava out of the bone of Adam Arishon, because he took something, he took that first initial spark, that initial creation, that Chachma, and he develops it into something else, something much greater. As Rav Soloveitchik says, he created the first community. Adam Arishon was a guy who's wandering around by himself. And as we all know, men wandering around by themselves, they're not going to end up anywhere good. So the Ribono Shel Olam says this is not a good Eitzah by himself. He should have a community. Where did the Ribono Shel Olam see that? He saw that through the realm, so to speak, of Bina, Vayiven, Hashem Elokim es hatzela. And that's why the idea of developing, you can take a seed, but then you need to develop it. The idea of insight, of seeing one thing through another, associated with Chava, is associated with women. Bina Yisera, the Gemara says, women have an unusual knack of taking one simple thing and developing it into something much greater. That's true even on a biological level when you talk about gestation, but it's true much more on an emotional and a spiritual level. That's why the letter Yud will be associated with an Ish, but the letter Hey, which is that growth and development, it's not just a seed, it's a whole world that's associated with women. Isha, Aleph Shin Hey, as opposed to Ish, which is Aleph Shin just with a Yud. So there is not just the ability to collect knowledge, information in the world. I'm going to hold the word knowledge. I should really take that back. But there's the idea of to take the information that we have and develop it and to see something deeper, to nurture it, and then to realize what can emerge from inside. And that's why, according to Kabbalah, again, I'm just understanding on the very surface level, the notion of Bina, our ability to see one thing inside something else, is referred to as the aim, the mother. Now, every human being has that quality of aim, but there's something about women that they have this greater intuition, this ability to nurture one thing from something else. It's a hisrachavus, it's an expansion. So you start with a yud is a speck, and that speck even has a tiny speck on the top, the kutzel shel yud. You have one blot of ink, but then you're going to take that yud and expand it dramatically. That's the world that we live in with the hey. That is the experience of Bina. You say one thing, but you understand that you also mean something much deeper. Sometimes you read a poem and you say, I see what the poem is saying, but I don't understand what is really beneath that poem. Or I understand one level, but maybe I don't understand many other levels. That's what, in a certain sense, that's what the idea of sod is in Jewish tradition. Bina, what's so powerful about Bina is that you're looking at it on the surface like everybody else. We're all looking at the same thing. But the B'nai Bina, the people who are able to see deeper, they understand what's behind those words. Because Chazal give us a very unusual expression. They say there's something called the Sod HaIbur. The Sod HaIbur, the secret of calculating the months. Why is it such a sod? It's a mathematical equation. The Gemara gives you the equations. The people who understand math, which is not me, but the people who know math, they figure it out. But that's the idea of sod, of seeing something beneath. When we're looking at the same words, but we're realizing what you're reading, which is much deeper, is beyond what I'm not grasping it. I'm only getting it on the level of Chachma. I'm not getting it on the level of Bina. B'nai Bina, those people, they saw something much deeper. That's on the level of Bina. But then, of course, on one side, if you have chachma, imagine you have one side, although if we're going to all look in the same direction. So chachma is going to be here on the right side, and bina is going to be on the left side. So between these two, the harmonious center is going to be das. So what is das? So sometimes when you have a concept and you want to understand what is the shorish, the source of this concept, you look in the first place where this word appears in the Chumash. That's usually the best way to understand the source of something. So the first time that this word das appears in Chumash is in the context of the intimate relationship between Adam and Chava. V'ha'adam yoda es Chava ishto. So says the Bnei Yissaschar, and this appears in many, many Sfarim, not just in the Bnei Yissaschar and Nisan, and Maimer Daled. Das is hiskashrus, connection. V'ha'adam yoda es Chava ishto, they became connected. And this exists in two ways. So we began by observing that we're made up of these two patterns, the pattern of 3 and the pattern of 7. So on one level, there is a bridge between our thought process, how we approach the world, the frame through which we see it, and the world of action. That bridge is das. It's the hiskashrus. It's the connection. It's what bridges our thoughts and our ambitions and our vision with the reality that we live in. So somebody might have a business idea or a vision for a trip or even an email that they're going to write. But where is it that that concept is translated into the olam? It's connected into the olam hamaisa. That's the concept of das. That's on one side. But the other side is this idea of something becoming part of your identity. When you have a yediyah, it is not simply a piece of information which is stored in your pocket. It's something that becomes part of you. It's fused into your identity. And this, says Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, is the secret to one of the great mysteries of the Torah. There is a story of a tree. The Gemara says, we're not sure what this tree looked like. It was definitely not an apple tree, but maybe it was a grapevine, maybe it was wheat. We don't know exactly what this tree is, but for some reason, this tree caused a whole lot of trouble. Because the Rebbeinu Shalom said to Adam and Chava, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel, you can eat from, and you should eat from, Gai Gesundheit, enjoy all the trees except one. This one tree, you should not eat. You can't eat this tree. What tree is it? The eitz hada'as tov v'ra. It's an eitz of da'as, tov and ra. So of course they eat from the tree, and a whole catastrophic sequence ensues. So the question that all the Rishonim, all the Achronim, everybody, they're trying to understand what is going on with this tree. What is the mystery of the tree? So Rav Kook says, let's analyze what is the name of the tree. That's going to give us some insight. It didn't say they ate from a geffen. It says they ate from an eitz hadas tov v'ra. So Rav Kook says, let's go back to the beginning. We said that chachma is information. Well, let's say you have somebody who is an engineer, so they know a lot of physics, right? If you have someone who is, a vascular surgeon, so they probably know something about chemistry. So they have a lot of information. But that information is held in their pocket. They utilize it. When they're in their, they're wearing their lab coat or their scrubs, when they're in their zone, they're utilizing that information to effectively accomplish their goal. So if you ask someone, well, what do you do? They would tell you that's their job, or they're a scientist and they utilize the science to create something. But the science, the chemistry, it doesn't become part of your identity. You are a chemist because you use your chemistry knowledge to create things. But if somebody looks at your personal identity, would they find, chemistry as part of who you are? It might be what we could call the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. There are things that appear on your resume because you did them. You were a banker. You were, a homemaker. You did all these things. But that's not who you are. So chachma, it exists on the level of information. But das, the kesher hapnimi, that's who we are. So Rav Kook says, in the world, we look around us, and there are many things that are tov and ra. We live in an age where technology is the latest gift that the Ribbono Shel Olam introduced into the world. And this is the Ribbono Shel Olam's ratzon. Rav Kook writes in the Ein Hayah, says that Motzoi Shabbos, Adam HaRishon was given the gift of fire, which is why, of course, we recite the Borei Me'orei Ho'esh, because the Ribbono Shel Olam told him, don't be scared that it's getting dark outside. Take 2 rocks and bang them together. So Rav Kook says, the Ribbono Shel Olam gave him that invention. In every generation, says Rav Kook, the Ribbono Shel Olam reveals inventions that are appropriate for that time. And the bracha of Borei Me'orei Ho'esh is the bracha on technology. So every technology is exactly like Eish. It has incredibly important contributions so that we should be warm and that we should be light, we should be lit up, but it also has the potential to burn. So today we have a technology that they didn't have 30 years ago. So this technology is a ta'aruvis. It's a mixture of tov. Rabbi Sachs said, I once heard him say that the advent of the internet, the Ribbono Shel Olam put it so that we should have the proliferation of Torah. So there's tov, but there's also horribly destructive ra. So there's a mixture of tov and ra. So what should a person do when they encounter something which is a mixture of tov and ra? We should approach it on the level of chachma. We should be careful with it. We should manipulate it. We should utilize it. We should figure out what is the best way to connect people using that thing. We should pick out the tov and we should leave the ra. That's in the realm of chachma. But what is das? Das is when something becomes absorbed into you. It's almost like you imbibe it. So what is the mashal of the world that sometimes is very amazing, but sometimes is very dangerous? It might be wine, it might be bread, which can become very inflated, and we make sure not to do that on Pesach. These are all mishalim. So the Ribbono Shel Olam said to Adam Rishon, it's a great world out there, and even the eitz, which is tov and ra, you should use it. But don't eat it. Don't take it in wholesale. Don't make it part of you, because when you eat that eitz, then you have das, then you have the tov, but you've also imbibed the ra. And now Adam HaRishon, after he ate it, so the Rambam and the Ramban, they all talk about how his whole perspective is all messed up because he's now tainted, because his kesher hapnimi, his inner perspective on life, also includes elements of ra. So realizing what is das, when you create that profound connection with something, it really becomes part of you. In a certain sense, you could say that's the difference between information and knowledge. It's the eitz of das, because it becomes a part of you. You eat it, you ingest it. It's who you become. If these 3 perspectives are true on the level of cognition, it's interesting that they're also true on a deeper level, on an emotional level. Because All of these have a dimension that relates to a person's heart. What does it say about those craftsmen who volunteered to work for Moshe Rabbeinu and B'Tzalel and Oholiav in the Mishkan? Uvalev kol chacham lev. There's such a thing as chachma of the lev. The pasuk says, "Ulevavo yavin," your heart will have bina. So there's chachma of the lev, there's bina of the lev, and of course, v'yadata hayom v'hashivosa el levavecha. So we have emotional intelligence. So the chachma of emotional intelligence is just knowing the facts. Who am I? And what am I about? And what is the circumstance that I find myself in? What's my social dynamic? The bina is to say, what is appropriate? Now that I know that fact, what's appropriate? And then das is internalizing it and actualizing it. And this is why, now you can understand why. Why is it the Chazal, they tell us that children don't have das. A katan is a lav bar das. It doesn't say that a katan does not have chachma, because children can memorize enormous amounts of information. And it doesn't mean that a child can't have bina, because a child can have insight. But my Rebbe Rav Moshe Stav once suggested, he said, here's the mashal. He is a great baal of mashalim. He says, you can teach a child who's under bar mitzvah, you can teach a boy all the maseches kiddushin and all the maseches ksubas, and they can learn exactly how to get married. And then they can understand what are the responsibilities of marriage and what are the implications of being married and being an Eishes Ish, and Eishes Ish beveis baila, shelo beveis baila. So then you ask a 10-year-old, so is it kedai to get married? So katan doesn't have das. Das is that life experience that you absorb that shapes your perspective, both cognitively and emotionally. So perhaps, although these ideas are very abstract, you're sitting and thinking, it makes sense that this is what we're talking about tonight. I'm speaking in front of people, and I readily acknowledge that I only knew a piece of the puzzle of the great masterpiece that was Harav Shael ben Reb Shmuel. I wouldn't want to use a term, but I have to use it just because it'll make it more. So I'll use his first name, even though it is not really Lefi Chavodo. We'll call him Reb Shael. Some called him Shaul, some called him Zaidi, some called him Abba. So I only knew him for 15 years. But the extent to which the people in this room and beyond knew him, it seemed to me, in thinking about this and in discussing it with Mrs. Bellows, that these are meta ways that he lived and taught and modeled for all of us. It's true there were many, countless things that he did, but it wasn't just what he did. It was the frame through which he lived his life and then did all of those things. He was involved in many specific projects, whether that was Arcola, which was blessed with so much of his time and insight, whether it was the shul, whether it was causes in Israel, education, business, family. But all of these things had these three elements. He was a man of remarkable chachma and bina and das. He was a man of chachma, first and foremost, because he loved learning. Again, it would not be bakavadik, but I could have and did think to borrow a bear's cap and a scarf for tonight. Because that is the image that I have of learning together for a decade on Sunday mornings. He loved chachma, his chavrusas in America and in Israel. He was committed to a life of wisdom, of becoming a person of tremendous chachma. And he wasn't just interested in learning chachma, he also was generous sharing that chachma with other people. So many people came to him for advice, for insight, for wisdom. He was chachma bevechinas koach ma, that he had this intuition, that muskel rishon, that if you sat down with him, you'd say in Yiddish, he would shots up a situation, he would look at it and analyze it and think about it, and instantly he would have a perspective. But he was also a chacham leiv. He was a remarkably empathic person. He might take your hand in his thin fingers and hold on to your hand as he would sit and listen to you, and he would look at you, and you knew that he was mamish listening to you. The fingers, holding on, just listening to you. And people sought out that chachma. He was also a person of remarkable bina, lahavin davar mitoch davar. It seems that this was true on a level of people. That sometimes we see people on a level of chachma, on the facts. What does it say on their resume? And then there are people who are b'nei bina, who see beneath the resume. They see the potential of people in front of them. They see someone who maybe other people who only live on the level of chachma, they wouldn't give them attention. They wouldn't believe in them. They wouldn't see the potential in that person. Because if it's not on the surface, say, lo kayam. But Reb Shael Zichrono Livracha, from just absorbing the stories and listening and seeing, he was from the B'nai Bina, so that even someone who maybe struggled, who maybe didn't fit in, who maybe was lost, he was able to see lahav and davar mitoch davar, the potential that that person had. So he would give that person a pat on the back or an arm on the shoulder, and he would give them chizuk and hadracha, because he saw the potential. He saw the bina. He was also a tremendous pikeach, a lahav and davar mitoch davar, on a pragmatic level. If he saw one issue, he also saw what was behind that challenge. Even on a simple level, 6 years ago, our lay leaders gave me a great gift. So I had 10 weeks going into our summer recess, where I was going to spend the time stepping away from all the kolel shiurim and all of my responsibilities. And I mentioned to him in the late spring that this was going to be my summer plan. And a short while later, I saw him in shul, and he called me over and he said, he realized that because our home situation is such that we're not picking up and leaving for 2 or 3 months between Chachama's responsibilities that require in-person work and our children who needed to be in school and camp, that I wasn't going to be going far, but it would be very important for me to have the space to learn and to prepare and think without the regular routine, you could say. So he called me over in shul and he said, at that time, he had an office. He had an office, I think it was technically the village of Morton Grove. Am I correct? It was on Lehigh Street. And he said, we have a corner office. This corner office, first of all, had a very shiny couch. It was unbelievable couch. It had a desk. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and a chair. And he said, I'm going to give you a key. And this office is going to be yours. And you can come and go anytime you please. And that became my home away from home, with Melissa Shetichya and Mr. Boker and the whole chabura over there for almost 3 months. I went almost every day. I brought my lunch, I had my svarim, I had my laptop, and I parked myself in that office. And it was the experience of a lifetime. And I will never forget that. But it was because he was such a maven davar mitoch davar that he knew, here's a young man who could use a little harchavas hadas. I didn't even know he had that building. I didn't know that. Who would know? But that was his pikchus. That was his lahavin davar mitoch davar, to engineer that summer for me. And that relates to the chacham lev, to the emotional capacity that he had to be caring for other people. And so part of the reason that we're doing this shiur at this time is because next week is Yom Yerushalayim. And for many years, Lahavda ben Achayim, Mrs. Bellows, and Reb Shael, they used to invite all of the kollel couples to dinner with them on Yom Yerushalayim. We used to go out to Shalitz because he was from the Bnei Bina. He understood that the kollel chaverim, maybe they don't have the time or the opportunity to take a night like that, to enjoy. It then became expanded into a dessert reception for a slightly larger group. But every year, we always looked forward to this. Some of the Heilige grandchildren were zoche to some of those Shalitz dinners, which Kenny didn't have to pay for, so he was happy. But who thinks of that? Only a Bnei Bina. It's not just that he made a contribution to the kollel. Of course, he made a contribution to the kollel, but then he was like, well, what would really mean something? And then, of course, because everything they did was in partnership, so Mrs. Bellows, she always had some gift for the wives. I don't know what that stuff is. It was bags and zippers, but it was unbelievable Bina. Who thinks of what the next thing is that's going to matter to that person? That was the type of Bina. And then, of course, there was the Das. The idea that Yiddishkeit was a part of him. It was a living, breathing part of the central, defined part of his existence. He would become so animated when he would talk about the things that were passionate in his life. Learning, and Israel, and his family. Every year at the Yom Yerushalayim dinner, he would tell the same Maisa. And even after many years, so I encouraged him, especially because there were new fellows all the time, that they should hear this Maisa. And it wasn't just that he told over the Maisa with the professor Sharif Bassioni, the law professor, and the exchange that they had during graduation when he had a transistor radio and he heard Har Abayit B'Yadenu and his whole exchange with Bassioni, but he mamish lived that story. Because Israel to him was a living embodiment. That was part of who he was. It wasn't a chachma. It wasn't like, oh, Israel is a value in the abstract, like math is necessary for an architect. It was who he was. He loved that. And if it meant making whatever arrangements was necessary so that the two of them could go, even though schlepping around wasn't always so easy as a team, even if it meant walking up 9 flights of stairs when some elevator was broken or whatever, because that was part of his mahus, that was his kesher hapnimi to Eretz Yisrael. It was his kesher hapnimi, his hiskashrus with generations. The same way that Das links the upper, the realm of the mochin of machshava to the lower, the bottom, the newer, the olam hamaisa. He was so proud, and he really identified with himself as a Baal HaMasora, as somebody who received from parents and teachers and rabbeim, and was committed to giving that to his children, to his grandchildren. He was that kesher, that hiskashrus. He always talked about learning with his grandchildren, with the boys and with the girls, with the bar mitzvah laning, and seeing the accomplishments and being there. I think he was also a shtickle travel agent on the side, Layode Vina, always figuring out how he could be a part of every grandchild's life, because he was an ish das, a person of his skashrus. And so you felt when we had this terrible loss just a little over a year ago, that when you were there in the house with all of the children and the grandchildren, even grandchildren that I never met who live in different cities, the way that they spoke and the way that they were and the way that they felt, it was obvious that each one of them had a special hiskashrus with their Zaidi, every single one, because he was an ish das. And so he just absorbed those connections with each of these children as they grew. And ultimately, this das comes back to v'ha'adam yoda eschava ishto, the way that he treated Mrs. Bellows shetichya liyamim tovim baruchim. The hiskashrus, the das, that Adam and Chava, Began Eden Mikeden, were envisioned to have, that we bless every young couple with, was exactly the model that we saw those who were in his orbit and in their orbit, and we only saw a little bit. Those who were closer saw even more what it meant to have a hiskashrus with a spouse, what it meant to be dedicated to your Eishes Chayil. If there was a red carpet to be had, he was rolling it out. If there was an accommodation, an arrangement, any opportunity there was, nothing would be spared. Nothing would stand in his way to help out Joan Shetichya. Nothing. He would drive to every appointment. He would schedule his whole world to make sure that he was there for her at any moment's notice. It was mamish like Began Eden Mikeden. You saw how they walked together. It was the cutest thing. She would walk right next to him. He would hold on to her. He had his jacket. She had her jacket. He would hold on to it. He would hang it up. It was Began Eden Mikeden. V'ha'adam yada eschava ishto. This was a model that especially those of us who are younger and are looking to see what it means to be a person of das, v'yadata hayom v'hashivosa el levavecha, to see the das of the lave that he demonstrated for us. It was a priceless gift that he showed us what it means to be a person of das. So when the Gemara says Malamed Shehoshivu Yeshiva al Kivro, that the tribute to Chizkiyahu was Talmud Torah, I'm sure that this Talmud Torah inspired many people based on the life that he led. But for our own leader, for our own beloved R Shael ben Reb Shmuel, Shael Bellows, Zichrono Livracha, we too are Malamed Sheyoshivu Yeshiva al Kivro. We gather to learn, but it's not just learning in the realm of Chachma, and it's also not even just learning on the realm of Bina, it's learning on the realm of Das. To take the remarkable qualities, the models, the way that he saw the world and he lived his life, and to incorporate them, Ish Kafi Mahalalo, each one of us, in the way that Kimi Machazikas can guide us and to carry us forward. Each one of us can live that life, and ultimately through that, be male his neshama further and further. The influence that he had on this community, on Jewish communities around the world, continues to expand. And so when the Ribbono Shalom looks at all the neshamas, it says Yom HaKippurim. The Ramah says Yom Kippur, it's l'chaim v'lamesim. So how could you have a kapar for someone who's not living? V'lamesim chavshi. It's because, as Rav Shechter Shalita points out, that after a person is gone, the ripple effects continue to expand. So those of us who live these lessons, who are seeking chachma, who when we see other people, we see what's beneath the surface, who absorb these lessons, these are all opportunities for us to continue the light of Shael and Mirza Hashem in our lives and our community. Ad Me'ah V'Esrim Shana, Ad Bias Kol Tzedek, B'mher V'Yameinu, Amen. My only